Take that off right now. You shouldn't be wearing that here." The voice was a harsh, raspy whisper, but the grip on my wrist felt like a steel vise. I blinked in shock, looking up from the polite handshake straight into the hard, unrelenting eyes of General Victor Kane. We were standing right in the middle of a crowded, brightly lit reception hall in Arlington, Virginia. It was a beautiful afternoon, and sunlight poured through the large floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the gleam of brass buttons and polished metals on the uniforms of the highest-ranking military officers in the country. It was supposed to be a standard commendation ceremony, a proud and normal moment in my career. I was Lieutenant Ava Cross, and I had just walked across the main stage to receive a commendation. Everything was going perfectly according to protocol. I extended my right hand to the general. He took it, but the exact moment his eyes dropped to my hand, the polite, practiced smile completely vanished from his face. He stared at the dark metal ring on my index finger as if it were a live grenade. "Sir," I asked, my voice barely audible over the loud chatter and clinking glasses of the reception room. He didn't answer. Instead, his thick fingers dug deeper into my wrist, the pressure bordering on painful. I noticed two of his personal security details shifting their weight immediately, their hands moving closer to their sides, their eyes locking onto us. The atmosphere around us shifted instantly. The casual, celebratory mood in our immediate circle evaporated, replaced by a thick, heavy tension. Before I could even ask him to let go, General Kane turned and practically dragged me away from the crowd, pulling me aggressively toward a heavy oak door at the far end of the hall. "General, what is going on?" I demanded as soon as the door clicked shut behind us, completely cutting off the noise of the party. We were standing in a small, private antechamber. He finally let go of my wrist, letting out a sharp breath. He ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking much older and far more stressed than he had out on the stage just a minute ago. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at my hand. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was cautious, almost fearful. "It belonged to my grandfather," I told him, rubbing the red marks on my wrist. "Arthur Cross." Kane's expression froze completely. He looked at me like I was a ghost walking among the living. Why grandfather, Arthur Cross, lived his entire life in the small, quiet, isolated town of Blackridge, West Virginia. To the rest of the world, he was absolutely nobody. To my own family, he was much worse than nobody. He was a nuisance. My father, a cold and extremely pragmatic man, never had a single kind word to say about him. Whenever grandfather's name was brought up at the dinner table, my father would just shake his head, tighten his jaw, and change the subject immediately. My mother was even more direct about her feelings. She constantly complained that the old man was nothing but a heavy burden to our family. She hated paying for his minor medical bills, hated the phone calls, hated the mere thought of him. And my older brother just thought he was a complete joke, always mocking the way grandfather lived alone in a remote, run-down house at the edge of the woods. I was the only person in the entire family who ever stood up for him. I would drive out to Blackridge whenever I got a weekend pass from the military. I brought him groceries, fixed his leaky pipes, and sat on his porch for hours, just listening to the silence of the woods with him. My family hated it. They could not understand why I wasted my time. My mother used to look at me with this irritating mix of pity and annoyance and say, "You're exactly like him. You are always believing in things that aren't real." They thought he was a crazy old man. They thought I was foolish for caring. They made me feel like the odd one out, the different one in a family that only cared about social status, money, and public appearances, but none of them were there when he died. I was the one who got the terrible phone call. IT happened just 2 weeks ago. My cell phone rang loudly on my nightstand at exactly 3:42 in the morning. It was the local police department down in Blackridge. They told me they found him dead in his home. The details the officer gave me over the phone didn't make any sense at all. The police report stated clearly that his back door was wide open when the patrol car arrived. The main breaker to the house had been cut, meaning all the power and lights were out. Even worse, there were obvious signs that someone had been inside the house, searching through his personal belongings. The local cops tried to write it off easily. They said it was probably just a local burglary gone wrong. A tragic accident where an old man's heart simply gave out from the fright of an intruder. But I knew better. I remembered the very last time I saw him, just a month before he passed away. He was incredibly paranoid, pacing around his living room for hours. He had suddenly grabbed my shoulders, looking at me with absolute, genuine terror in his old eyes, and whispered his final, desperate warning to me. Don't trust them, Ava. Not anyone, even if they wear a uniform. At the time, I thought his mind was just slipping. I thought it was dementia setting in. But after getting that 3:42 a.m. call, those exact words echoed in my head on repeat. They were a clear, direct warning that the military or people operating under official authority might not be safe to trust. When I drove down to clear out his house, the place was completely trashed. Drawers were pulled out, books thrown on the floor. The police had already left, closing the case quickly, and my family flat out refused to come help me. Let the state handle the mess, my father had told me over the phone before hanging up. So I cleaned it up alone. While scrubbing the floorboards in his bedroom, I noticed a loose plank under his bed. I pried it up. Underneath, carefully hidden and wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas, was a small, heavy wooden box. That was where I found the ring. I had never seen him wear it in my entire life. It was heavy, made of some dark, unpolished metal that didn't shine in the light. When I looked closely at the inner band, I saw a strange insignia engraved deeply into the metal. I know military insignias. My job requires me to know every branch, every special unit, every historical division of the armed forces. But this mark didn't belong to any military system I had ever seen, studied, or heard of. It was a complete anomaly. I put it on my finger that very day, mostly out of spite and defiance. My parents had let him die alone, unloved and completely ignored. Wearing his ring was my personal way of keeping him close to me, a silent protest against my family's cold cruelty. I didn't realize what I was putting on my hand. I had no idea it was highly dangerous. I found out quickly enough that it wasn't just an old piece of jewelry. A few days after I returned to my apartment complex, I was walking down the hallway and ran into one of my neighbors. We usually said hello, but the second his eyes caught the strange ring on my finger, his face went completely pale. He didn't say a single word. He just turned around and immediately walked the other way, practically running to avoid me. I thought his reaction was bizarre, but I tried to brush it off. Then came the funeral. It was a pathetic, heartbreaking sight. There were barely any people in attendance. It was just me, the local priest, and a couple of distant neighbors who looked like they wanted to leave before the casket even touched the bottom of the grave. My parents didn't even bother to show up, but as the brief service ended and the grave diggers started their work, I noticed an older woman standing near the back of the cemetery line. I had never seen her before. She waited patiently until the priest finally walked away to his car before she approached me. Her eyes were sharp and alert, darting around the empty graveyard constantly as if she expected us to be attacked at any moment. She stopped a few feet from me and spoke in a low, rushed, and urgent voice. "Your grandfather saved my life," she said firmly, before I could even process what she meant or ask her how. Her eyes dropped to my hand. She saw the ring. I heard her breath hitch in her throat. "But if they know you have that thing, you are going to be in terrible danger," she whispered, stepping back. She didn't give me a single chance to ask who they were. She turned around and walked away instantly, moving fast and disappearing into the long rows of gray headstones before I could even call out her name. Now, standing in this private, quiet room with General Kane, all those strange, terrifying pieces were starting to click together in my head. General Kane stood in the center of the small antechamber, staring at me with a mix of dread and absolute disbelief. The heavy oak door behind us had clicked shut, completely muffling the bright sounds of the reception hall. I was still rubbing my wrist, where he had grabbed me, waiting for an explanation. My heart was pounding aggressively against my ribs, but my military training kicked in, keeping my posture straight and my facial expression perfectly neutral. "General, with all due respect, I need you to explain what is going on," I said, keeping my voice steady and firm. "You look like you've seen a ghost, and you just physically dragged a junior officer away in front of your entire security detail." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh, running a rough hand over his short gray hair. "A ghost," he muttered under his breath. "Yeah, Lieutenant, that is exactly what I just saw. Take that ring off your finger right now." "I am not asking you. I am giving you a direct order." I hesitated for a fraction of a second, but the absolute, terrifying seriousness in his eyes made me pull the dark metal band off my index finger immediately. I held it quietly in my palm. It felt heavier now, as if the dangerous secret it carried was adding physical weight to the metal itself. "Do you have any idea who your grandfather really was?" Kane asked, his voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper. "He was Arthur Cross," I replied defensively, feeling a sudden urge to protect his memory. "He lived in a rundown cabin in West Virginia. My family hated him. He died completely alone 2 weeks ago." Kane shook his head slowly, looking at me with genuine, deep pity. "That was his cover, Ava. That was the pathetic life he had to build just to stay alive. Arthur Cross wasn't just some crazy old man living out in the woods. He was a founding member of a military unit so highly classified that even the president doesn't get briefed on its operations unless it is absolutely necessary. We called it Echelon Black." I stared at him, trying desperately to process the words. Echelon Black. I had spent years of my life studying military history, classified operations, and covert intelligence groups. I knew all about the ghost units, the Black Ops teams that operated completely off the official books. But I had never, not once, heard a single whisper or read a single redacted file about anything called Echelon Black. "You wouldn't have heard of it," Kane said, perfectly reading the confusion on my face, "because it was officially wiped from every single historical record we have. The unit was completely erased from existence. The men and women who served in it ceased to exist on paper. They had no social security numbers, no military IDs, no families they could safely contact. They were literal ghosts tasked with doing the impossible, handling the kind of dark, dirty work that the government desperately needed done but could never, ever admit to." He pointed a shaking finger at the ring resting in my hand. "That ring is a unit marker. Only the original, founding members of Echelon Black carried them. It was their way of identifying each other in the field when all other communications went permanently dark. I only know about it because my old mentor was one of the military liaisons who helped clean up the massive mess when the unit was finally disbanded, or rather, when it was violently purged." A cold chill ran straight down my spine. "Purged. The people your grandfather worked for decided that Echelon Black knew way too much. They became a massive liability to the state. So the government didn't just retire them. They actively hunted them down. Arthur must have gone into deep, permanent hiding in that miserable little town just to survive the purge. And you just walked into a room full of the highest-ranking military officials in the nation wearing a giant target on your hand." Kane stepped closer, his imposing figure blocking the light coming from the small window. "Listen to me very carefully, Lieutenant. If they know you have that ring, you will not just be watched. You will disappear. They will erase you just like they erased him." My mind immediately flashed back to the state of my grandfather's house. The open back door, the cleanly cut power lines, the aggressively ransacked drawers. The local police had quickly called it a simple, tragic burglary. But everyday burglars don't systematically cut the main power lines. Highly trained professionals do. "Hide it," Kane commanded, turning back toward the heavy wooden door. "Do not wear it. Do not show it to anyone else. And for God's sake, watch your back, because if they realize Arthur passed something on to you, Your life, as you currently know it, is completely over." He didn't wait for me to respond. He opened the door, plastering that fake, polite smile back onto his face, and stepped out into the crowded hall, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet room. My hands were visibly shaking. I slipped the ring into the deepest pocket of my dress uniform and waited 10 full minutes before sneaking out of the building entirely. I didn't stay for the rest of the commendation ceremony. The real nightmare began the very next day that I lived in a secure apartment complex just outside the military base. It was a gated community with active cameras and regular security patrols. I always felt completely safe there, but that feeling of safety vanished the moment I woke up on Tuesday morning. My personal cell phone rang loudly on my nightstand at exactly 4:15 a.m. When I answered it, there was no voice on the other end. Just dead, heavy, suffocating silence. I hung up, assuming it was a random spam call. But it happened again at 5:30 a.m. and again at 7 a.m. Every single time I answered, nothing but a quiet, rhythmic static greeted me. When I finally got to my office on the base, I logged into my secure military email terminal. Right at the top of my heavily encrypted inbox was a message from an unregistered sender that was supposed to be technologically impossible on our network. I opened the email cautiously. There was no text, no subject line, just a long, complicated string of randomized numbers and strange symbols. It looked like corrupted data to a normal person, but my gut told me it was a direct message. It was a digital tap on the shoulder, a silent way of saying, "We know exactly who you are, we know exactly where you work, and we can reach you anywhere." That I tried my best to focus on my daily duties, but the heavy paranoia was already setting in deeply. Kane's warning echoed in my head on a continuous, terrifying loop. I took the ring and threaded it onto a thick silver chain, wearing it tightly around my neck, perfectly hidden beneath my uniform shirts. It felt like a freezing piece of solid ice resting against my chest point 3 days later. The psychological warfare escalated into something physical. I came home very late after a grueling 12-hour shift at the base. The moment I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, my military instincts flared up aggressively. The air in my apartment felt entirely wrong. It was stale, heavy, like someone had been breathing it in just moments before I arrived. I drew my service weapon immediately, dropping my keys quietly onto the kitchen counter, and moved silently through the dark hallway. I cleared the living room, the kitchen, and the bathroom with my gun raised. Nobody was there, but as I walked cautiously into my bedroom, I saw the signs. They were incredibly subtle, the kind of tiny details a normal civilian would never notice. But I am not a normal civilian. I am trained to notice the details. The heavy wooden chair by my desk had been shifted roughly 1 inch to the left. The sliding door to my closet wasn't completely flush with the frame like I always left it. My laptop, which I always kept positioned exactly parallel to the edge of the desk, was slightly angled that I rushed straight to my jewelry box and my small personal floor safe. Nothing was broken. I frantically checked my electronics, my emergency cash, my expensive watches. Everything was exactly where I left it. Nothing was stolen at all. They hadn't come to rob me for money. They had come to toss my place, to meticulously and professionally search every single inch of my apartment to see if I had hidden anything belonging to Ava Cross. They were actively searching for the ring. I sat on the edge of my bed, my gun still gripped tightly in my sweating hand, staring blankly at the slightly moved chair. They had successfully breached a secure building, bypassed my heavy locks without leaving a single scratch, thoroughly searched my home, and left without leaving a single piece of hard evidence behind. It was an absolute masterclass in intimidation. By the end of the week, they didn't even bother hiding in the shadows anymore. I first noticed the car on a rainy Friday evening. It was a sleek, matte black sedan with heavily tinted windows, completely devoid of any distinguishing marks, bumper stickers, or even license plates. I was driving down the interstate to grab some groceries, and I saw it perfectly positioned exactly 2 car lengths behind me. When I changed lanes, it smoothly changed lanes. When I took a random, unnecessary exit just to test my growing theory, the black sedan followed right behind me. It never drove aggressively. It didn't try to run me off the road or tailgate me to cause a panic. It just stayed there, a constant, looming, mechanical shadow in my rearview mirror, letting me know that I was completely trapped in their sights. I pulled into the crowded, brightly lit parking lot of the grocery store, desperately hoping to lose them in the thick sea of pedestrians and vehicles. I parked right near the front glass doors, my hands gripping the steering, while so tightly my knuckles were completely white. I watched through my windshield as the black sedan cruised slowly past the main entrance. It didn't stop. It just kept rolling, eventually disappearing around the back corner of the large brick building. I let out a long, shaky breath, sinking back into my seat, thinking I had finally gotten a brief moment of peace. I reached for my door handle to get out. Suddenly, my cell phone vibrated violently in the center cup holder. I picked it up with a trembling hand. It was a standard text message from a blocked, unknown number. There was no greeting. There were no demands for money or negotiations. It was just 5 simple, terrifying words that made the blood in my veins run absolutely cold. Return the ring. Last warning. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat of my car, the engine still idling quietly in the grocery store parking lot, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. Return the ring. Last warning. I didn't reply to the message. You never reply to a direct threat like that. Instead, I memorized the unknown number, turned the device completely off, and physically pulled the battery out of the back. I realized in that exact moment that I wasn't just dealing with common thugs or local criminals. I was dealing with highly trained professionals who could track a live digital signal in a matter of seconds. I drove back to my apartment complex using 3 different convoluted routes, constantly checking my rearview mirror for any sign of the matte black sedan. It didn't reappear, but the heavy, suffocating feeling of being watched stuck to my skin like wet mud. I desperately needed answers, and there was only one person still alive who knew enough to give them to me. I knew I couldn't just walk up to General Kane on the military base in broad daylight. That would instantly compromise both of us. So, early the next morning, I used a secure, unlogged landline in the basement of the base communications center to call his direct office line. When his aide answered, I left a highly specific, seemingly mundane message using an old operational code phrase I had learned in advanced intelligence training, requesting a blind meet. If Kane really knew the inner workings of Echelon Black, he would immediately recognize the protocol. He did. 12 hours later, I found myself sitting in a rundown, 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of Alexandria. It was past midnight. The place was almost entirely empty, smelling faintly of stale black coffee, cheap frying oil, and industrial bleach. I deliberately chose a cracked vinyl booth all the way in the back, sitting so I had a clear line of sight to the front door. At exactly 1 a.m., the little brass bell above the entrance chimed sharply. General Kane walked in. He wasn't wearing his pristine uniform with the shiny brass buttons and polished metals this time. He wore a faded, oversized civilian jacket and a dark baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, and he looked incredibly tired, as if the weight of the last few days had aged him a decade. He slid into the booth opposite me without saying a word. He didn't bother to look at the laminated menu or order anything from the waitress nodding off behind the counter. He just reached inside his thick jacket and pulled out a heavily worn, unmarked manila folder. He placed it flat on the sticky formica table between us and kept his large hand firmly planted on top of it. "You are playing a very dangerous game, Lieutenant," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble barely audible over the harsh hum of the diner's old refrigerator. "I'm not playing anything," I shot back, keeping my hands perfectly still on my lap to hide any shaking. "I am being hunted. My apartment was tossed by professionals. I have black sedans tailing me on the interstate. And yesterday, someone texted my personal cell phone telling me to return the ring." Kane's eyes darkened significantly. He let out a heavy, ragged sigh, his broad shoulders slumping forward. Then they have already initiated a cleanup protocol. I warned you, Ava. I told you to hide that damn thing. I did hide it, I told him, feeling the cold metal pressing against my chest through my shirt. But clearly they know I have it, and I am not going to just sit around and wait to be disappeared. I need to know why my grandfather was so important that they are willing to threaten a decorated military officer over a piece of old metal. Tell me. Kane looked around the empty diner one last time, his eyes sweeping the windows and the parking lot outside, before slowly sliding the folder across the table to me. I opened it carefully. Inside were just a few loose, highly degraded photocopies of old military documents. Half the text was aggressively redacted with thick black marker, completely blacked out. But at the top of the first page, there was a name, clearly typed out, Ava Cross. Next to his name was a classification code I didn't recognize, and an internal title that made my stomach drop instantly. The document listed his internal title as the Phantom Handler. What does this mean? I asked, looking up at him, my brow furrowed in deep confusion. What exactly is a Phantom Handler? Echelon Black didn't just assassinate high-value targets or steal foreign state secrets. Kane explained, leaning in close, so his voice was barely a whisper. They handled the deepest, darkest intelligence, assets the United States government ever created. Spies placed so deep behind enemy lines that legally they did not exist. But sometimes an operation goes completely sideways. An asset gets compromised. When that happens, you can't just send in a rescue chopper. You can't publicly acknowledge they are yours. You have to scrub them from the face of the earth before the enemy can extract any information. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at the faded paper in my hands. That was Arthur. He was the Phantom Handler. His specific, solitary mission was to erase human traces and completely take compromised spies off the map. He erased human traces. He gave dead spies new lives. And if they couldn't be safely saved, he made sure they left absolutely nothing behind for the enemy to find. I stared at the redacted papers, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. My grandfather, the quiet, eccentric old man who fixed leaky pipes and sat on a lonely porch in West Virginia, was a master of making people disappear. But why hunt him down? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. If he was doing a vital job for the government, why did they purge Echelon Black? Kane took a slow sip of water from the glass the waitress had dropped off earlier. Because Arthur didn't just handle foreign operations. Toward the end of the Cold War, Echelon Black was tasked with domestic missions on American soil. There were missions that the government completely denied ever happened. I'm talking about operations so illegal, so fundamentally corrupt, that if the files ever saw the light of day, it would tear the entire intelligence community apart and put half of the Pentagon in federal prison. He looked at me with a desperate, heavy sadness that made me physically ache. Arthur knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. He knew the new identities of every single deep cover asset he ever relocated. He was a walking, breathing vault of the most dangerous secrets in American history. When the higher-ups decided to burn Echelon Black to the ground to cover their own tracks, Arthur was their primary target. He was supposed to be executed. But he survived! I whispered, the reality of my grandfather's life finally sinking in. He hid in Blackridge. He survived because he was the absolute best at what he did, Kane said flatly. He erased himself. He became a pathetic old man that his own family despised. It was the perfect ultimate cover. Your parents treating him like garbage was exactly what kept him alive for decades. Nobody looks twice at a lonely, ignored old man. Kane tapped the folder again. The government thought he was dead, or at least they desperately hoped he was. But finding his body 2 weeks ago triggered an automatic alert in the Black Ops community. They sent a team to his house to ensure he hadn't left behind any operational logs, any ledgers, any proof of what he did. They are terrified, Ava. Terrified of what? I asked. Terrified of the ring, Kane said, his eyes locking onto mine with fierce intensity. That ring isn't just a piece of jewelry. It's a physical key. Arthur wouldn't have kept it unless it led to something important. Echelon black operatives use those rings to encrypt and decrypt physical drop boxes. If they are demanding you return the ring, it means they know Arthur left a fail-safe behind. A ledger, a list of names, something that can completely expose them. I felt the heavy metal ring pressing against my chest. Suddenly, the entire situation crystallized perfectly in my mind. My grandfather hadn't just died of a random heart attack. He was murdered because they finally found him. But before they could break him, he hid the ring for me to find. He trusted me. He left me the key, which meant he must have left me the lock, too. I need to go back to his house, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical punch to the gut. When I cleaned out his bedroom, the police had already been there. The Black Ops team had already tossed the place. But Arthur was the phantom handler. If he hid something, he hid it in a way they would never, ever find. Kane looked at me, genuinely terrified. If you go back there, they will follow you. It's an absolute death sentence. They're going to kill me anyway, General, I said, grabbing the manila folder and sliding it smoothly into my jacket. If I don't find what he left behind, I have zero leverage. I am just a loose end. Kane didn't try to stop me. He just nodded slowly, looking at me as if I was already a ghost. I left the diner in Alexandria at 1:45 a.m., my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I didn't go back to my apartment. I knew they were already watching the perimeter, waiting for me to make a mistake. Instead, I drove straight toward the interstate, pointing my car west toward the dark, winding mountain roads of West Virginia. The drive to Blackridge usually took about 4 hours, but tonight it felt like an absolute eternity. Every single set of headlights that appeared in my rearview mirror made my muscles tense with anticipation. I took multiple unnecessary detours, exiting the highway and getting right back on just to ensure no matte black sedans were trailing me in the dark. I was completely alone in the dead of night, relying entirely on the paranoid survival instincts my grandfather had subtly tried to teach me during my weekend visits. When I finally crossed the town line into Blackridge, the sun was barely starting to peek over the Appalachian ridges, casting a cold, gray light over the dense forests. The town was exactly as depressing and isolated as I remembered. I drove past the boarded-up gas station and the empty diner, heading straight for the dirt road that led to my grandfather's property at the absolute edge of the woods. I parked my car about a half-mile away, hiding it deep behind a thick cluster of overgrown evergreen trees. If a Black Ops team was already watching the house, I didn't want to announce my arrival with the sound of a roaring engine. I hiked the rest of the way on foot, keeping a low profile, my hand hovering near the concealed service weapon holstered tightly at my waist. The house looked incredibly sad in the early morning light. It was a small, weather-beaten cabin that looked like it was slowly being swallowed by the surrounding wilderness. The yellow police tape that had been stretched across the front porch after his death was now torn and snapping weakly in the cold wind. I stepped onto the wooden porch, wincing at the loud creak of the floorboards, and pushed the front door open. The inside of the house was still a complete disaster. The local police had done a basic sweep, but the professional operatives had clearly done a highly meticulous one. The floor was covered in scattered books, overturned furniture, and broken plates. The couch cushions were sliced wide open, the stuffing ripped out and tossed aside carelessly. Every single floorboard that squeaked had been aggressively pried up. The walls had been tapped and drilled into. They had aggressively searched for his secrets, tearing apart the pathetic life Ava Cross had built to see what he was hiding beneath it. I stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the physical wreckage of my grandfather's cover identity. I needed to think exactly like him. General Kane said Arthur was the phantom handler, a master of making things completely disappear. A man with his level of training wouldn't just use a loose floorboard or a hollowed-out book to hide his ultimate insurance policy. Those were amateur tricks. He knew exactly how professional sweepers operated because he used to be one that I closed my eyes and tried to remember everything about the layout of this house. I remembered the long summers the first spent sitting on his porch, watching him work on the cabin. He was always repairing things, measuring wood, calculating strict dimensions. I opened my eyes and looked at the hallway leading to his small bedroom. The hallway was incredibly narrow, much narrower than a standard house of this layout should be. I had never thought about it before, but the structural proportions were slightly off as I walked down the short corridor, dragging my hand along the old, peeling floral wallpaper. The professional sweepers had drilled small holes into the drywall to check with fiber-optic cameras, but they had strictly checked between the wooden studs. I stopped right outside his bedroom door and looked at the heavy, solid oak door frame. When I was a teenager, I helped him replace this exact frame. I remembered complaining loudly about how heavy the wood was. He had just smiled and told me that a strong frame is what keeps the whole house from collapsing. I dropped to my knees and examined the thick baseboard right next to the wood. There was a tiny, almost invisible seam in the grain. It wasn't a crack from old age. It was a deliberate, razor-thin cut that I pulled my tactical knife from my belt and wedged the sharp steel blade into the microscopic gap. I pushed hard, using my entire body weight as leverage. With a sharp, mechanical click, a small latch mechanism released. A rectangular section of the lower wall, entirely hidden behind the baseboard and perfectly flush with the door frame, popped out. My breath caught in my throat. I reached my hand into the dark, dusty void inside the wall. My fingers brushed against cold, heavy metal. I grabbed the handle and pulled it out. It was a solid steel lockbox, incredibly heavy, completely covered in a thick layer of dust. This was his real secret compartment, built directly into the structural foundation of the house. Successfully bypassing the standard wall sweeps of the Black Ops team, I carried the heavy box into the kitchen, setting it down on the only table that was still standing upright. The lockbox didn't have a keypad, a combination dial, or a standard keyhole. It simply had a strange, circular indentation right in the center of the heavy steel lid. I stared at it for a few seconds before reaching under my shirt. I pulled the heavy, dark metal ring off the silver chain around my neck. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I pressed the ring perfectly into the circular indentation. It fit exactly. I applied pressure and twisted the ring clockwise. A heavy, satisfying click echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. The locking mechanism disengaged. I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled perfectly in protective foam, was a thick, leather-bound notebook. It looked incredibly old, the dark leather worn smooth from years of handling. I took a deep breath, pulled the notebook out, and carefully opened it. The pages were filled with my grandfather's neat, precise handwriting. It wasn't a personal diary. It was an incredibly detailed, highly classified operational ledger. I turned the pages slowly, my eyes scanning the dense rows of information. There were names, dates, and highly specific geographic coordinates. I recognized some of the names immediately from historical military briefings I had studied. They were high-level operatives, deep-cover spies, and foreign defectors who had famously vanished without a single trace during the height of the Cold War. According to the official government narrative, these people were killed in action, captured by the enemy, or simply went rogue. But right here, written clearly in my grandfather's steady hand, were the exact coordinates of their final relocations. They hadn't died. Arthur had completely erased them and planted them somewhere else. The ledger documented massive, highly classified events that were never disclosed to the American public. There were meticulous records of secret extractions, illegal black book funds, and domestic operations that completely violated every single law in the country. As I flipped further into the thick book, I noticed something else. Not every entry was written in standard black ink. Some pages, detailing the absolute most sensitive and illegal operations, were stamped with a dark red ink. I looked closely at the mark. It was the exact same strange insignia that was engraved on the inside of my ring. He used it to distinctly mark the special missions. These were the nightmare operations that Echelon Black had executed on American soil. The exact domestic missions General Kane had warned me about. I read one page stamped with the ring's insignia. It detailed the systematic removal of a whistle-blowing politician in the late 1980s. The official national news report stated the man had died in a tragic private plane crash due to engine failure. My grandfather's ledger proved that the crash was entirely manufactured by his unit, and it listed the exact names of the commanding officers who officially ordered the hit. This notebook was an absolute death sentence for anyone holding it, but it was also the ultimate shield. It was the only physical proof that Ava Cross was telling the truth, and the absolute only leverage I had against the powerful people who were currently hunting me. The operatives who wanted the ring didn't care about a piece of jewelry. They were utterly terrified of this exact notebook. They desperately needed to destroy it to ensure their dark past stayed buried forever. I sat in the broken, silent kitchen for a long time, staring at the undeniable proof of my grandfather's terrifying reality. He wasn't a crazy old man. He wasn't a burden. He was a man carrying the heaviest, darkest secrets of an entire nation on his shoulders, entirely alone. And my family had treated him like an absolute pariah. They had mocked him constantly, completely ignoring the massive sacrifices he had made just to keep breathing. The hot anger I felt toward my parents and my older brother suddenly flared up, burning much hotter than the fear in my chest. They had let him die alone in this house, completely oblivious to who he really was. I slammed the leather notebook shut and shoved it deep into my tactical backpack. I grabbed the empty steel lockbox and wiped it completely clean of my fingerprints, tossing it back into the hidden compartment in the wall and snapping the wooden baseboard shut. I made sure to leave the house looking exactly as wrecked as I found it. I didn't want the sweepers to know I had been here, and I definitely didn't want them to know I had successfully found the ledger. I walked quickly out the back door, slipping silently into the thick tree line. I navigated the dense woods, making my way back to where I had hidden my car. The morning sun was fully up now, blindingly bright against the windshield. I threw my backpack onto the passenger seat and climbed behind the steering wheel. I locked the doors and started the engine, that I knew exactly what I had to do next. I couldn't just run and hide in the shadows. I couldn't disappear like he did. If I was going to survive this nightmare, I had to understand exactly who my grandfather had become to protect himself. And to do that, I needed to face the people who had forced him into that lonely, miserable corner in the first place. I pulled my phone out of the glove box, popped the battery back in, and dialed my father's number. It was time to go back home and force my family to finally look at the ugly truth they had ignored for decades. I drove straight from the mountains of West Virginia to my parents' house in an upscale, quiet suburb of Northern Virginia. The contrast was physically nauseating. My grandfather had lived and died in a rotting cabin at the edge of the woods to protect us, while my parents lived in a massive, pristine, 5-bedroom colonial house with perfectly manicured lawns and a 3-car garage. They had spent my entire life obsessing over their social standing, their country club memberships, and their spotless public image. Ava Cross was the only dirty, shameful stain on their perfect record, and they had spent decades trying to scrub him out of their lives completely that I didn't bother knocking. I just unlocked the heavy mahogany front door with my spare key and walked straight inside. I was covered in dust from the hidden wall compartment, my clothes were wrinkled, and I hadn't slept in over 24 hours. My boots left dirty scuff marks on the gleaming hardwood floor of the foyer, and my parents and my older brother, David, were all sitting in the bright, sunlit living room. It was Sunday afternoon. My father was holding a glass of expensive scotch, casually watching a golf tournament on the massive flat-screen television. My mother was flipping through a high-end home decor magazine, and David was texting someone on his phone. It was the absolute picture of oblivious, privileged comfort. They all stopped what they were doing and stared at me the second I walked into the room. "Ava, what on earth are you wearing?" my mother asked, her face immediately twisting into a familiar mask of disapproval. You track dirt all over the floor. Were you out in the woods again? I just came from Black Ridge, I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. And why father instantly sighed, heavily setting his scotch glass down on the glass coffee table. He didn't even look at me. He just rubbed his temples like I was giving him a severe migraine. Ava, we already talked about this, he said, his tone dripping with absolute exhaustion and annoyance. I told you to let the state handle the mess down there. There is absolutely no reason for you to keep dragging yourself down to that miserable cabin. He is gone. It is over. It is not over, I replied, walking further into the room and dropping my heavy tactical backpack onto the pristine white sofa right next to David. David jumped slightly, looking at me like I was losing my mind. It hasn't even started. What are you talking about? David scoffed, rolling his eyes. Are you still playing detective about his so-called break-in? The local cops said it was a robbery, Ava. Just drop it. You're embarrassing yourself. I ignored my brother completely. I unzipped the main compartment of my backpack, reached inside, and pulled out the manila folder General Kane had given me, along with the heavy, leather-bound operational ledger I had pulled from the hidden wall safe. Ava threw the documents down hard onto the glass coffee table right in front of my father. The heavy thud made my mother jump in her seat. What is this garbage? My father demanded, his face flushing with immediate anger. That garbage is the actual truth about Arthur Cross, I said, staring directly into his eyes. That is the undeniable proof of exactly what he did for a living, and why he spent the last 30 years hiding in the woods while you treated him like a stray dog. My father stood up, his face turning red with absolute fury. He was a liar, he yelled at the top of his lungs, pointing a shaking finger at the ledger on the table. He was a paranoid, delusional, deadbeat liar who abandoned his real responsibilities to this family. I don't care what crazy nonsense he wrote down in some old book. He ruined my childhood. He embarrassed us constantly, and I am not going to let you bring his toxic insanity into my house. He didn't abandon you. I yelled back, stepping right into his personal space, refusing to back down. He erased himself to keep you alive. He was part of an off-the-books Black Ops unit called Echelon Black. He was known as the Phantom Handler. He erased the human traces of compromised deep-cover spies and relocated them so the enemy couldn't find them. And when his own government decided to burn his unit to the ground and execute everyone involved, he made himself disappear so they wouldn't come after you to get to him. The living room went completely dead silent. The only sound was the muted cheering of the golf tournament on the television, and why father stared at me, his chest heaving, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find the words to shut me down again. But he couldn't, because he looked down at the table. He saw the highly degraded photocopies from General Kane. He saw the official, heavily redacted government seals. He saw the terrifying red insignia stamped on the thick pages of the ledger. "Look at it," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Look at the coordinates. Look at the names. Look at the operations he carried out on American soil. He knew where every single body was buried. He was a walking vault of the most dangerous, highly classified secrets in this country. And the people he worked for finally found him 2 weeks ago." My father's hands began to shake violently. He slowly reached down and picked up the manila folder. His eyes scanned the blacked-out lines, his face draining of all color. The anger completely vanished from his eyes, instantly replaced by sheer, unfiltered terror. Father started to panic. He dropped the folder back onto the table as if the paper was physically burning his skin. They murdered him. David whispered from the couch, his arrogant attitude entirely gone. "Yes, David, they murdered him," I said coldly. "And then they aggressively tossed his house, looking for that exact ledger. But he was smarter than them. He hid it in a structural compartment they couldn't find, and he left me the key to open it." I pulled the dark metal ring out from under my shirt, letting it dangle on the silver chain. My mother let out a sharp, trembling gasp. She covered her mouth with both hands, staring at the ring, then at the ledger, and finally at me. Tears immediately welled up in her eyes. Mother realized they had ignored the truth for their entire lives. She realized that every single time she had complained about his medical bills, every time she had called him a heavy burden, every time she had mocked his profound paranoia, she was insulting a man who was enduring absolute psychological torture just to ensure she could sleep safely in her expensive bed. We didn't know," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "Ava, we had absolutely no idea." "You didn't want to know," I told her, showing no sympathy. "You just wanted him to be quiet and stay out of your perfect, wealthy life. You thought he was crazy because he checked his locks 5 times a night. You thought he was delusional because he never trusted the police. He wasn't crazy. He was a highly trained professional waiting for the executioners to finally knock on his door." My father backed away from the table, practically collapsing back into his expensive armchair. He looked like a completely broken man. The reality of his father's massive sacrifice was crushing him right in front of my eyes. "Ava," my father choked out, his voice a pathetic, raspy whisper. If they found him, and if you have that book, then they are coming for me." I finished his sentence for him. "My apartment has already been broken into. I am being actively tailed by black sedans. They sent a direct threat to my personal cell phone yesterday, telling me to return the ring. They are doing a cleanup protocol, and I am the last remaining loose end." My mother let out a loud, terrifying wail, reaching out to grab my arm. "You need to give it to them. Give them the book, Ava. Give them whatever they want, so they leave you alone." I ripped my arm away from her grip. "It doesn't work like that," I said harshly. "If I give them the ledger, I have zero leverage. The absolute second they have this book in their hands, I am completely useless to them. They will put a bullet in the back of my head and make it look like a tragic training accident on the base. This ledger is the only thing keeping me breathing right now." "Then go to the police," David yelled, standing up in a panic. "Go to the FBI. Go to the press. We can hire lawyers. Ava, we have money." I looked at my brother with absolute pity. "David, the people hunting me are the ones who write the paychecks for the people you want to complain to. They don't care about our money. They don't care about our lawyers. They operate completely off the books. There is no legal system that can protect us from this." I zipped the ledger back into my tactical backpack and slung it over my shoulder. "I didn't come here to ask for your help. I came here to tell you to pack your bags. If they are watching me, they will eventually look into my family. You need to leave this house right now. Go to the airport, buy tickets with cash, and fly to Europe. Do not use your credit cards once you land. Do not tell your friends where you are going. Just disappear." I turned around and walked toward the front door, leaving my family completely shattered in their pristine, perfect living room. The truth had finally come out, and it was violently tearing their comfortable world apart. But I didn't have time to hold their hands. I had a war to fight, and I had to figure out how to use Arthur's secrets before the real monsters caught up to me. I drove away from my parents' massive, pristine house with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't look back. I knew they were panicking inside, desperately trying to figure out how to salvage their perfect suburban lives now that the ugly, terrifying reality of Ava Cross had shattered their comfortable bubble. But I couldn't waste another second worrying about them. I had my own immediate survival to worry about. I was carrying a heavily classified operational ledger in my backpack that made me the #1 target for a ghost military unit. I knew I couldn't go back to my own apartment, and I definitely couldn't stay anywhere connected to my name or my military ID. I drove for another 2 hours, crossing state lines into Maryland, completely avoiding the main highways. I finally pulled into a rundown, cash-only motel on the side of a forgotten state route. It was the kind of place that didn't ask for ID and didn't have security cameras scanning the parking lot. I paid a tired-looking clerk for 2 nights using the emergency cash I kept in my glove box, parked my car around the back, and locked myself inside room number 12. The room smelled like cheap bleach and old cigarette smoke. I pulled the curtains tightly shut, deadbolt the heavy wooden door, and shoved a wooden chair under the handle just to be absolutely sure. I dropped my tactical backpack onto the sagging mattress, unzipped it, and pulled out the heavy, leather-bound notebook. I sat cross-legged on the bed, staring at the dark cover for a long time before finally opening it again. I in the kitchen at his cabin. I had only skimmed the pages in a panicked rush. Now, sitting in the quiet safety of this cheap motel room, I actually took the time to read through his meticulous handwriting. The details were staggering. Arthur hadn't just erased deep-cover spies. He had orchestrated massive, highly complex logistical miracles to keep these people alive. He created entire fake histories, transferred untraceable funds across global banks, and secured new identities so perfectly crafted that even federal databases couldn't flag them. He was a complete genius. But the further I read into the red-stamped pages, the illegal domestic operations on American soil, the more I understood why his former commanders were so desperate to put a bullet in my head. He had documented undeniable proof of severe corruption, political assassinations disguised as accidents, and black book funding that tied directly back to current, high-ranking officials in the Pentagon. As I reached the very back of the ledger, my fingers brushed against something thick tucked inside the back cover. The heavy leather binding had a false flap, carefully glued down to look like a normal seam. I pulled my tactical knife from my belt and carefully sliced the old glue. I reached inside the narrow gap and pulled out a sealed, yellowed envelope. My name was written across the front of it. For Ava.m. My heart slammed against my ribs. I dropped the knife onto the bed and stared at my grandfather's neat, precise handwriting. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I tore the top of the envelope open. Inside was a single, folded piece of thick stationery paper. I unfolded it, taking a deep, shaky breath. It was a letter, written specifically to me, dated just 3 months before his death. Ava, if you are holding this letter, it means my worst fears have finally come true. It means my time ran out. They finally found me, and they silenced me before I could finish my work. But more importantly, if you find the truth, it means you are stronger than me. You actually dug deeper. You didn't just accept the easy lies they told you. You used the ring, you found the wall safe, and you uncovered the life I tried so desperately to bury that I owe you a massive apology, kid. I am so sorry for the terrible burden I just placed on your shoulders. I know what this ledger means. I know the massive target it puts on your back. The people who are coming for you are ruthless, highly trained, and they operate entirely outside the boundaries of the law. They are the same people I used to work with, the same people who decided Echelon Black knew too much and had to be violently erased from existence. I spent the last 30 years of my life acting like a pathetic, crazy old man living in the middle of nowhere. It was the absolute hardest thing I ever had to do. I watched your father grow up hating me. I watched your mother treat me like an annoying, heavy burden. I listened to your brother mock me. Every single insult, every rolled eye, every ignored phone call, it hurt more than any bullet I ever took in the field. But I had to take it. I had to let them hate me, because their absolute disgust for me was the perfect cover. Nobody looks twice at an isolated old man abandoned by his successful, wealthy family. My pathetic life kept them completely off the radar. It kept them safe. It kept you safe. But you were always different, Ava. You never bought the act entirely. You came out to that rotting cabin. You sat with me on the porch. You showed me actual, genuine kindness when I was absolutely starving for it. You have no idea how much those quiet weekends meant to me. They were the only things keeping me sane in a mind full of terrible, dark memories. I didn't want you to live like me. I never wanted you to spend your life constantly looking over your shoulder, jumping at shadows, pushing everyone you love away just to survive. That is a miserable, cold way to exist, and you deserve so much better. but I still left a path for you. I left you this ledger because I knew, deep down, that the ghosts of Echelon Black would eventually catch up to me. And when they did, I knew they wouldn't stop with me. They would sweep my life, and they might eventually look at you. This notebook is your absolute leverage. It is the only physical proof that can completely destroy the men hunting you. I am giving you a choice, Ava. You can take this book, disappear into the wind, and live the rest of your life in the shadows exactly like I did. Or you can use the information in these pages to fight back. You can find the people I saved. You can use their new identities to build a network, expose the corruption, and burn their Black Ops program straight to the ground. Whatever you choose to do, please know that I am incredibly proud of you. I never had the courage to fight them openly. I chose to hide to protect my family. But you are a soldier, Ava. You are wearing my ring now. Do not trust anyone in a uniform who tells you they are there to help. Trust your own gut. Trust your training. I love you, kid. Give them hell. Arthur. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring completely as hot. Heavy tears streamed down my face. I hadn't cried since the police called me at 3:42 in the morning to tell me he was dead. I had been too angry, too paranoid, too aggressively focused on simple survival. But sitting in this cheap motel room, reading his final words, the emotional dam completely broke. This letter was an absolute emotional finishing blow. It hit me harder than any physical threat ever could. Why grandfather wasn't just a victim of a corrupt government system. He was a deeply loving man who intentionally sacrificed his entire reputation, his relationship with his only son, and his own happiness just to keep us breathing. He took the absolute worst of my family's cruelty and used it as a shield to protect them from the monsters he used to work for. And in the end, he trusted me enough to hand me the ultimate weapon. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve, taking a deep, ragged breath. I carefully folded the letter and slipped it into my uniform pocket, right next to the dark metal ring. I looked down at the open ledger on the bed. He had given me a clear choice. I could run or I could fight. But looking at the names of the people he had saved, the deep cover assets he had successfully relocated and protected, an idea started to form in my mind that I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide in the woods like he did. But I also wasn't going to just hand this book over to a journalist or a politician and hope for the best. I needed to gather my own army. I needed to find the people Ava Cross had saved, the ghosts he had given second lives to. I reached for my encrypted cell phone and started dialing. The war was officially on. I sat on the edge of the sagging motel bed, staring at the encrypted cell phone in my hands. I spent the next 48 hours entirely off the grid, doing exactly what my grandfather had trained me to do without me even realizing it. I didn't run away, and I didn't try to hide in the woods. Instead, I carefully deciphered the emergency contact protocols hidden in the back pages of his ledger. They weren't standard phone numbers or basic email addresses. They were old-school, highly secure digital drop boxes and classified communication relays that only deep cover operatives would ever know how to access safely. I sent out a single, blind broadcast to a dozen different secure channels listed in his notebook. The message was incredibly brief and direct. I used the specific red insignia from the ring as my digital signature, formally identified myself as Arthur's granddaughter, and stated clearly that the phantom handler had passed away. I requested a secure meeting to honor him, giving them a time and a highly encrypted geographic pin. Honestly, I expected absolute silence. These people were literal ghosts. They had spent decades hiding from the government, successfully blending into normal society because Arthur had perfectly erased their pasts. Coming out of the shadows just to meet a complete stranger was an immense, life-threatening risk. I thought maybe 1 or 2 of them would show up, or maybe they would just ignore the message entirely to protect themselves, but I was completely wrong. The response I got was immediate and overwhelming. Within a few hours, a secure, untraceable reply bounced back to my burner phone. It contained a set of coordinates for a private, heavily guarded estate nestled deep in the quiet mountains of upstate New York. It was a massive, secluded property owned by one of the high-level assets Arthur had relocated during the late 80s. The message simply read, "We are waiting for you. ... I packed my tactical bag, loaded my service weapon, and drove straight north through the night. The heavy paranoia of being hunted by the Black Ops team was still sitting squarely on my chest, but the fear was slowly being replaced by a fierce, burning sense of purpose. When I finally arrived at the given coordinates, the sun was just starting to set, casting long, dark shadows over the snow-covered grounds of the estate. Two men in dark coats met me at the heavy iron gates. They didn't ask for my ID or search my car. They just looked at the dark metal ring I was wearing on my finger, nodded respectfully, and escorted me inside. When I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the main hall, I stopped completely dead in my tracks. I was absolutely stunned. This was the second memorial for Ava Cross. And this time it was nothing like that pathetic, lonely, heartbreaking funeral back in Blackridge where my own parents hadn't even bothered to show up. This time, there were a lot of people showing up. The massive room was filled with dozens of individuals. There were men and women of all different ages, different races, and vastly different backgrounds. Some of them looked like incredibly wealthy corporate executives wearing expensive tailored suits. Others looked like regular, working-class citizens, mechanics with rough hands, quiet school teachers, and tired-looking retirees. They were the ghosts, the very people who had been saved by his hands. Every single person standing in this room was a former deep-cover spy, a compromised asset, or a targeted whistleblower that Ava Cross had personally pulled from the absolute brink of death. The older woman I had briefly met at the first cemetery in Blackridge stepped forward from the crowd. She gave me a warm, sad smile and gently squeezed my shoulder. She didn't look terrified and paranoid anymore. Surrounded by the other survivors, she looked completely at peace. The gathering wasn't formal at all. There was no priest, no empty religious prayers, and no fake, polite condolences. It was an incredibly raw, deeply emotional peak of the entire journey. We all stood together in the center of the large room, sharing a quiet, respectful silence. When people finally started to speak, the absolute climax of the evening hit me harder than I could have ever prepared for. Nobody in that room talked about the wars they had fought. They didn't talk about the complicated politics, the highly classified missions, or the terrible things they had done for the government. They only talked about Arthur, the tall, older man with a thick Eastern European accent, stepped into the center of the circle. He had a deep, jagged scar running down the side of his neck. "I was compromised in East Berlin in 1986, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The secret police were actively kicking down the front door of my safe house. I had my gun loaded, ready to end it myself. And then Arthur came through the window. He didn't just extract me. He gave me a new name, a new history, and a chance to actually have a family. He saved me." A younger woman, who looked like a normal suburban mother, wiped tears from her eyes as she spoke next. "I was a domestic asset. My own commanding officers ordered a hit on me when I found out about a black book funding operation," she whispered. "Arthur found me bleeding out in an alley in Chicago. He patched me up in the back of a stolen van and drove me across 3 state lines. He gave up his entire career, his entire life, just to make sure I didn't become another redacted statistic. He disappeared so I could live." One by one, the ghosts shared their stories. They echoed the exact same sentiments over and over again. "He saved me. He gave me a second chance. He was the only one who actually cared." I stood there listening to them, the heavy leather ledger burning a hole in my backpack. The contrast between this room and my parents' pristine living room was absolutely sickening. My family had looked at Arthur and seen a crazy, burdensome, pathetic old man who embarrassed them at country club dinners. But the people in this room looked at him like he was an absolute savior. He was their guardian angel, a man who willingly stepped into the darkest, most dangerous corners of the world to pull them out, asking for absolutely nothing in return. He had intentionally absorbed all of my family's disgust and hatred so that he could maintain his cover. He took their insults with a quiet smile because he knew that his pathetic, lonely existence in that rotting cabin was the exact shield that kept these dozens of people breathing safely. It was the ultimate, most selfless sacrifice I had ever witnessed in my entire life. "He left you the ledger, didn't he?" the older woman asked quietly, pulling me out of my thoughts. "Yes," I answered, my voice steady. "And the people who purged Echelon Black are currently hunting me for it. They want to destroy the book, and they want to erase me, just like they finally erased him." The room went completely silent. The sadness in their eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, hard, professional determination. These were not helpless civilians. These were the most highly trained, lethal operatives the government had ever produced, and they had spent the last 3 decades quietly living in the shadows, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The tall man from East Berlin stepped forward again, looking directly at me. "Arthur protected us when nobody else would. We owe him our lives, Lieutenant Cross. If the people who killed him are coming after you, they're going to have to go through every single ghost in this room first. You are not alone." I looked around at the circle of faces. I had come here expecting to just pass off the information, to maybe find a safe place to hide. But Arthur hadn't just left me a book of secrets. He had left me an entire, highly capable army. He had built a network of fierce loyalty that spanned across the entire globe, all tied together by the dark metal ring on my finger. The executioners from the Black Ops team thought I was just a terrified junior officer running for my life. They thought I was a loose and they could easily tie up in the dark. But they had absolutely no idea what Arthur Cross had actually built in the shadows. I took a deep breath, feeling the heavy weight of my grandfather's legacy settling firmly onto my shoulders. The fear was completely gone now. "Good," I said, looking back at the crowd, "because we aren't going to hide anymore. We are going to use his ledger. We are going to hunt them back." We didn't sleep at all that night. The massive, quiet estate in upstate New York transformed entirely from a place of solemn mourning into a highly active, heavily fortified command center. These people might have been living quietly as mechanics, school teachers, and corporate executives for the last 30 years. But they hadn't forgotten a single thing Arthur had taught them. They were the absolute best deep-cover operatives the government had ever produced, and they seamlessly slipped back into their old roles. Laptops were opened, secure encrypted networks were established, and satellite uplinks were actively engaged at. I sat at the head of a long, heavy oak dining table, the thick leather ledger resting open in front of me. For the next 3 days, we meticulously photographed, scanned, and digitally encrypted every single page of my grandfather's operational notebook. We didn't just back it up, we weaponized it. The ghosts used their decades of accumulated resources to set up a massive, global dead man's switch. The heavily encrypted files were distributed to dozens of secure servers scattered across Europe, Asia, and South America. If I was killed, or if any of the operatives in that room suddenly went missing, the system would automatically trigger. The unredacted files, containing undeniable proof of every single illegal assassination, Black Book funding operation, and domestic sweep Echelon Black had ever conducted, would be simultaneously emailed to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and every major international intelligence agency on the planet. We weren't going to fight them with guns. A loud, violent shootout was exactly what the Black Ops sweepers wanted, because they could easily cover that up as a tragic accident. We were going to fight them with the absolute guarantee of mutually assured destruction. Once the digital fail-safes were securely locked in place, it was time for me to step out of the shadows and deliver the ultimate ultimatum. I left the estate alone, driving my car straight back down to Washington, D.C. I didn't take any back roads this time. I didn't check my rearview mirror, and I didn't try to hide my digital footprint. I actively turned my personal cell phone back on and used my credit card to buy a cup of coffee at a brightly lit cafe right in the middle of downtown. I wanted them to find me. It only took them exactly 45 minutes. I was sitting on a park bench near the National Mall, watching the tourists walk by, when the sleek, matte black sedan pulled up smoothly to the curb directly in front of me. The back door opened instantly. I didn't hesitate. I stood up, walked over, and climbed into the back seat, entirely on my own terms. There were two massive, heavily armed men sitting in the front seats, but my attention was completely focused on the man sitting next to me in the back. He was an older man wearing a sharp, expensive gray suit. He had cold, dead eyes and the rigid, unyielding posture of a career military commander. He didn't introduce himself, and I didn't ask for his name. I already knew exactly what he was. He was the man who had ordered the hit on Ava Cross. "You have been causing us a massive headache, Lieutenant Cross," the man in the gray suit said, his voice smooth but dripping with an underlying lethal threat. "We asked you very politely to return government property. Instead, you decided to run. Where is the ledger?" I didn't say a word. I simply unzipped my jacket, reached into my inner pocket, and pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of printer paper. I handed it to him. He took it, his brow furrowing slightly in annoyance. But the absolute second he unfolded the paper and read the text printed on it, the smug, superior look on his face completely shattered. It was a high-resolution photocopy of a red stamp page from the ledger. It was a page detailing a highly illegal domestic operation that this exact man had personally authorized 22 years ago. It had names, exact banking coordinates, and the precise times of death for 3 American citizens who had been quietly silenced to protect a defense contract. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice suddenly sounding incredibly fragile as the blood completely drained from his face. "The original ledger is currently resting in a fireproof vault that you will never, ever find," I told him, looking him dead in the eyes, my voice perfectly steady and ice-cold. "Every single page of it has been fully digitized, encrypted, and loaded onto a global dead man's network. There are currently 63 highly trained, deep-cover operatives monitoring my vital signs. If I don't walk out of this car in exactly 10 minutes, or if I suddenly have a tragic training accident on the base next week, the decryption keys will automatically deploy. Your entire shadow command will burn to the ground, and you will spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal supermax prison." He stared at me, sheer, unfiltered panic finally breaking through his professional facade. He looked exactly like my father had looked in the living room, a man violently confronted with the terrifying consequences of his own actions. "You think you can blackmail the United States government?" he sneered, trying desperately to regain control of the situation. "I am not blackmailing the government," I corrected him sharply. "I am blackmailing you. I know exactly how Echelon Black operates. You are a ghost unit. You don't exist, which means if this massive scandal drops, the Pentagon will instantly disavow you. They will throw you directly to the wolves to save their own reputations. You have absolutely no backup, and you have no way out." I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a harsh, commanding whisper. "Here are my terms. You're going to officially close the file on Ava Cross. You're going to call off your sweepers. You're going to delete my apartment from your surveillance grid. And you're going to completely forget that I, or any of the people Arthur saved, ever existed. If you ever send a black sedan to follow me again, I will pull the trigger and ruin you. Do we have a clear understanding?" The man in the gray suit gripped the photocopy so tightly that the paper began to tear in his trembling hands. He was a ruthless predator who had spent his entire career successfully hunting people in the dark. But he knew exactly when he was definitively beaten. He swallowed hard, his jaw clenching tight, and gave me a single, stiff nod. "Good," I said smoothly. I reached for the door handle, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped out onto the crowded, sunlit sidewalk. I didn't look back as the black sedan immediately pulled away from the curb, quickly disappearing into the heavy afternoon traffic. They were gone. The hunt was officially overdone a few weeks later. My life returned to a strange, quiet kind of normal. My parents and my brother had actually taken my advice. They panicked, sold the massive suburban house at a significant loss, and moved somewhere deep in Europe, completely terrified of shadows they didn't even understand. They had spent their entire lives treating Arthur like an isolated pariah, and now they were the ones living in paranoid exile. It was a bitter, deeply ironic justice, but I stayed. I went back to my apartment, I went back to the military base, and I resumed my normal duties as a lieutenant. But everything inside me had fundamentally shifted. I stood before a massive choice. With the leverage I held, I could easily expose the entire truth to the world, burning down the corrupt system and publicly clearing my grandfather's name once and for all. But exposing the truth also meant exposing the ledger, which would completely destroy the quiet, hard-earned lives of the ghosts Arthur had sacrificed everything to protect. I chose to keep silent, exactly like he did. I realized that some victories aren't meant to be celebrated on the evening news. Some wars are won in the quiet, unseen corners of the world, fought simply to keep the innocent breathing for one more day. I kept the dark metal ring, wearing it openly on my finger, not as a target anymore, but as a silent, powerful badge of honor. It completely changed the way I lived. I was no longer just a junior officer following blind orders. I was the new phantom handler, the silent guardian of the ghosts he left behind. I looked down at the heavy metal band catching the sunlight as I walked across the base. He didn't teach me how to be a hero. He taught me how to do the right thing even when nobody is looking.